Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank each of the witnesses who testified today for your expertise and your illuminating comments. I want to begin by talking about the U.S. share of commercial launch right now. In 2012, as I understand it, there was roughly $2.4 billion in commercial launch revenues, and only about $108 million of that was attributed to the United States. And I'd like to ask each of the members of the panel why you believe that's the case and what can be done to increase the U.S. share of that business.
Senator Cruz, I would offer for your consideration much of the difficulty in marketing U.S. launch systems abroad stems from the ITAR regulations, which restrict the use of U.S. technology for good reasons, to prevent missile technology from falling into the hands of foreign states that could use it for bad purposes. But what we've seen is this caused other nations to develop their launch systems and in fact take away much of the business. I had opportunity to travel to India for NASA in my last year there, and we talked with the Indian Space Agency officials, and they thanked us very profusely for ITAR because that prodded them to build their own indigenous launch vehicles, and they use them to launch satellites today, and they're commercially available, and we see that around the world. So I am not an expert on how to solve this regulatory problem, but I would offer for your consideration that that is a major factor in making U.S. Satellite launches non-competitive worldwide.
Yes, Senator Cruz. Financing continues to be a barrier, a difficulty for companies who intend to do space launch rockets. It has been and continues to be a problem. I think what Mr. Hale just said with regard to ITAR is a big one, although we are seeing some improvements in the export control area. But other launching states have taken full advantage of that by advertising a place to do ITAR-free launches and satellites of satellites, which works to the disadvantage of the U.S. This has much to do with why I so strongly recommended the continuation of indemnification. At a minimum of 10 years on a permanent basis would be excellent. I think that it's important for all of us to recognize that indemnification is the one thing that the U.S. industry has as it enters into negotiations for launch with other competing launching states, that it can say its government stands behind it in risk-sharing mode. It's not an automatic provision. It's a recommendation to Congress for an emergency appropriation above what is required by the company to purchase in terms of insurance. And it's a protection for the government. So I think that it'll be really, really important for us to give as full consideration as possible to that, and that continue as a way of fostering the opportunity to increase market share.
Senator Cruz, I don't really have much substantive to add to the argument, but I mean, the observation is that this is a global marketplace, and to the extent that you can compete, you're going to be better at market share. And so the things that Mr. Hale and Ms. Smith have identified, which are ITAR regulation or ITAR reform, and extension of indemnification to provide a more level playing field for our providers vis-a-vis the foreign competitors, I think is key.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I don't work in that end of the business. I shouldn't speak as an expert here. I do speak to a lot of people and work with them in industry, and I would say that that exposure leads me to give you more confidence in what the other people have said.
Very good. And let me ask a follow-up question, in particular Mr. Hale and Ms. Smith, which is, what do you all see as the most significant legal or regulatory obstacles to the continued expansion of commercial launch operations?
I would have to side with Ms. Smith that I think one of the greatest things that would be of benefit to this commercial enterprise is continued indemnification. The high costs of insurance and, frankly, the uncertainties in the American legal system are of great concern to investors. And as we look forward to private industry providing lower cost launch systems that will be competitive in the world market, we must find a way to ensure that they are reasonably protected in these areas.
Let me speak first to the question from the suborbital sector side. We have an oddity of sorts in the FAA, that we have a line of business that has statutory authority to license and regulate and promote the U.S. commercial launch industry, responsible as a one-stop shop to do that licensing, regulating, and promoting. We have hybrid launch vehicles that have aviation elements as well as space elements. And the question is, as often arises in a regulatory agency where you have differing industries, who has responsibility when it's operating as anything other than an express launch vehicle? I think that that is an issue that only Congress can resolve legislatively by amending the Act to make it clear that the reasoning, the motivation behind allocating that responsibility to the Office of Commercial Space Transportation still holds. It's very important to those launch operators in that it causes increased costs when they have to travel between two regulatory authorities. It could also cause inconsistencies when it comes to safety. So extremely important in order to further that industry and not delay its business plans and its launch plans going forward to become a full-fledged industry sector. I think that to the extent that as commercial space has evolved over time, it's a cyclical industry. It has had several fits and starts, but it has continued with the passion and the intent to move forward to become one day a full-fledged line of transportation, form of transportation. So I think to the extent that things like indemnification, things like resolving any regulatory tangles, continuing the opportunity through the flexibility that is allowed in the statute for these vehicle operators to test and develop, do more testing and development, collect sufficient data to move forward is extremely important, and one that I would encourage that approach.
Very good. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.